In 2023, Australia quietly entered a per capita recession, only the third time this has happened in the past 4 decades. On paper, the country still looks stable. Headline GDP numbers weren't flashing red. Unemployment wasn't spiraling out of control. But for everyday Australians, something felt deeply wrong. When you adjust for population growth, the average person was effectively going backward. Wages, once a symbol of Australia's strong middle class, fell back to levels not seen since 2011. Think about that for a moment. Over a decade of progress, erased. And this came after a series of national shocks. Devastating bushfires, a global pandemic, rolling lockdowns, and massive fiscal stimulus. So what was hitting Australians the hardest? It wasn't abstract economic theory, it wasn't political drama, it was something much more personal. The cost of living. And at the center of that storm sits one market that has reshaped the nation's future: housing. A 40-year boom that changed everything. Over the past half-century, Australia has experienced one of the most dramatic housing booms in the developed world. Since the early 1970s, property prices across capital cities have increased roughly 36 times. Let that sink in. If you compare income growth to housing growth, they simply don't match. Property values have raced ahead at a speed wages could never keep up with. Today, Sydney consistently ranks among the most unaffordable housing markets on the planet. From the outside, Australia looks like a dream. Surrounded by oceans, endless beaches, clean cities, world-class universities, safe communities, it feels like a modern paradise. But living in paradise comes at a cost. And that cost is rising fast. To purchase a median-priced home in Melbourne today, a household needs to earn around $170,000 per year. In Sydney, that number climbs to approximately $260,000 annually. Now compare that to the median household income in those cities, closer to $100,000. The math doesn't work. For many families, home ownership isn't just difficult, it's out of reach. It's just a Sydney problem. Or is it? Some argue this is simply a Sydney or Melbourne issue. That if you move further out, to Brisbane, Adelaide, or Perth, affordability improves. But the data tells a different story. Since 2020, home prices in Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth have surged by more than 50%. During the same period, wages increased by roughly 12%. Prices are accelerating, incomes are crawling. The gap widens every year. And the group hit hardest? Young Australians. Those under 34 haven't benefited from decades of rising property values. They didn't buy in during the 1990s. They didn't ride the 2000s boom. Instead, they're trying to enter the market after prices have already exploded. Home ownership rates for Australians under 34 have fallen by nearly 25%. For many, the traditional life milestones, buy a home, start a family, build stability, are being delayed indefinitely. And then there are the extreme examples that highlight just how distorted the market has become. In Sydney, a deteriorated home, lacking a functioning kitchen, electricity, and even a toilet, still triggered a bidding war. It ultimately sold for millions, not because of its condition, but because of its land. That's how powerful scarcity has become. Fine, I'll just rent. If buying is impossible, renting should offer relief. Historically, it did. For decades, Australian rents increased at a steady, manageable pace. But since 2020, rental growth has accelerated sharply. Annual increases exceeding 8% have become common in major cities. In Sydney, median rents have crossed the $3,000 per month mark. Brisbane trails not far behind. Now consider this. People are paying 2024 rent prices with wage levels that resemble 2011. That gap creates pressure, financial and psychological. And even if you can afford the rent, finding a place is another challenge entirely. Rental inspections often resemble competitive events. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of applicants competing for a single property, lines wrapping around city blocks, online listings disappearing within hours. Tenants aren't bidding for luxury. They're competing for basic shelter, a place to sleep, a place to live, a place to call home. The Australian dream. Fading? For decades, Australia sold a simple promise: Work hard, play by the rules, and you'll build a comfortable life. That promise is beginning to crack. When housing absorbs such a massive share of income, everything else suffers. Savings decline. Entrepreneurship falls. Family formation slows. Risk-taking disappears. People become defensive instead of ambitious. The real estate market, once a symbol of prosperity, has become a source of anxiety. So how did this happen? How did one of the most resource-rich, stable, and geographically vast countries in the world develop one of the most unaffordable housing markets? Is it immigration? Is it a failure to build enough homes? Is it government policy? Or is it something deeper, embedded in the structure of the economy itself? In this series, we're going to unpack the forces driving Australia's housing crisis, the economic incentives, the cultural decisions, the policy choices made over decades by governments of all stripes. Because this isn't a one-year problem. It's the result of a system that has been quietly reshaped for generations. And understanding that system is the first step toward fixing it. If housing prices are exploding, the simplest explanation is supply and demand. Too many people. Not enough homes. Case closed. But as with most economic crises, the reality is more complicated. Let's start with the most debated factor: immigration. The immigration surge. In the 2022 to 2023 financial year, Australia welcomed nearly 740,000 new migrants. That figure stunned policymakers and economists alike. It was not just a rebound from the pandemic. It was the largest annual intake in modern Australian history. Compared to pre-COVID levels, migration jumped by roughly 200,000 people. When you add that many residents in such a short period, demand for housing rises almost instantly. Every new arrival needs somewhere to live. And most begin in the rental market. Roughly 70% of new migrants are renters, particularly temporary visa holders such as international students and skilled workers. This concentrates demand pressure in specific neighborhoods, especially migrant-heavy suburbs in Sydney's southwest and Melbourne's southeast. In some of these areas, rents surged by nearly 18% in a single year. And in competitive markets, migrants are often willing to share housing with multiple occupants to reduce costs. Splitting bedrooms, living in multi-family arrangements, maximizing every square meter. This makes economic sense for them, but it intensifies competition for locals. So yes, immigration has amplified rental pressure. But here's where the narrative becomes more nuanced. Blaming immigration alone doesn't explain everything. Because migration levels, while volatile year to year, have broadly followed long-term population growth trends. Australia has been a high immigration country for decades. What changed wasn't just demand. It was supply. The construction slowdown. While Australia's population has steadily grown, housing construction has not kept pace. In 2023, only about 170,000 dwellings were completed, the lowest figure in a decade. This happened during one of the largest population increases in a generation. That mismatch is critical. Even more concerning, when you measure new housing starts relative to total population, the trend has been declining since the late 1960s. Around the year 2000, construction rates fell sharply and never fully recovered. The result? A structural housing shortage that compounds year after year. But why isn't Australia building more? The catch-22. Facing builders. On the surface, demand is enormous, prices are high. You would think developers would rush to build. Instead, many construction companies are struggling, and some are collapsing. Why? Because building costs have surged. Since 2020, material prices and labor costs have risen significantly. Supply chain disruptions during the pandemic increased the price of timber, steel, and imported components. Skilled labor shortages pushed wages higher. Developers signed fixed-price contracts before costs spiked, and then found themselves building homes at a loss. Some projects were delayed, others were abandoned entirely. Higher interest rates only made matters worse. Financing costs increased, squeezing margins further. So builders are stuck in a paradox. Demand is strong, but profitability is fragile. And when profitability disappears, supply slows. The suburban mindset. Now we reach a uniquely Australian factor: culture. Australia is one of the most suburban countries in the developed world. Sydney and Melbourne have population densities of roughly 2,000 people per square kilometer. Compare that to London at around 6,000, Munich above 4,000, Amsterdam around 3,600. Australian cities are geographically vast but relatively sparse. For generations, Australians have favored detached single-family homes with backyards. Space is seen as part of the national identity. It represents freedom, privacy, and family life. And in theory, Australia has the land to support this model. Sydney alone has greenfield development areas that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of additional homes. So why not simply build outward? Because land availability on a map does not equal buildable land in practice. The NIMBY effect. Enter the NIMBY phenomenon. Not in my backyard. Across Australia, proposed housing developments often face fierce local opposition. Residents object to increased traffic, reduced green space, changes to neighborhood character, and pressure on infrastructure. Community groups mobilize. Councils delay approvals. Developers enter lengthy review processes. In New South Wales, obtaining approval for a single residential development can take over 100 days on average. In some municipalities, it stretches beyond 250 days. In contrast, certain U.S. states approve similar projects in a matter of days. That delay matters. Every month of waiting increases financing costs. Every regulation adds compliance expenses. Every appeal increases uncertainty. Over time, these barriers create what economists call artificial scarcity. Land becomes more expensive, and not because it's physically limited, but because access to develop it is restricted. Since 2020, detached home values have risen at roughly 3 times the rate of apartment prices, reflecting the premium placed on scarce land. And scarcity benefits one group enormously: existing homeowners. Who wins? And who loses? If you already own property, limited supply is good news. Your asset becomes more valuable. Your equity increases. Your wealth grows passively. But if you're a young person trying to enter the market, limited supply is devastating. Homeownership rates among young Australians have dropped dramatically compared to the general population. The latter is being pulled up behind previous generations. And this isn't necessarily the result of malicious intent. It's the unintended outcome of policies and cultural preferences interacting over decades. High population growth, slowing construction, rising building costs, restrictive zoning, community resistance, a preference for low-density living. Individually, each factor seems manageable. Combined, they form a perfect storm. But we're still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Even if supply were tight and demand were high, housing wouldn't necessarily spiral to these extremes without one additional force: incentives. Specifically, tax incentives that make property one of the most attractive investment vehicles in the country. Up until now, we've talked about supply shortages, immigration spikes, construction bottlenecks, and suburban sprawl. But none of those alone fully explain why Australian housing feels less like shelter and more like a financial asset class on steroids. To understand the deeper forces at play, we need to look at incentives. Because in economics, incentives shape behavior. And in Australia, the incentive structure around property is unlike almost anywhere else in the developed world. The origins of negative gearing. Let's rewind to the 1930s. Australia was facing a housing shortage and wanted to encourage private investment in rental properties. To stimulate supply, policymakers introduced a tax policy known as negative gearing. Here's how it works. If you own a rental property and the costs of holding that property, mortgage interest, maintenance, insurance, exceed the rental income you receive, you are making a loss. In most businesses, a loss is painful. In Australia, that loss can reduce your taxable income. Imagine you earn $100,000 per year from your job. If your rental property loses $10,000, you can deduct that loss from your income, meaning you're taxed as if you earned $90,000 instead. That reduces your tax bill. Effectively, the government subsidizes part of your investment loss. The idea was simple: encourage rental supply. But over time, something interesting happened. Instead of focusing on rental income, investors began focusing on capital gains. They were willing to accept short-term losses because they expected long-term price growth. And historically, they were right. A rare policy in the developed world. Negative gearing in its current form is extremely rare. Among OECD countries, only a handful have similar policies. And even then, often with stricter limitations. In the 1980s, the Australian government attempted to restrict negative gearing. The reaction was swift and politically explosive. Critics argued it would push rents higher and hurt the housing market. The policy was quickly restored. And since then, it has remained largely untouched. The lesson? Once a benefit is granted, removing it becomes nearly impossible. Debt becomes cheaper. Speculation becomes easier. At roughly the same time negative gearing gained popularity, Australia removed interest rate controls and modernized its financial system. Borrowing became easier. Credit became more accessible. And suddenly, property investment could be heavily leveraged. Instead of buying a home outright, investors could use debt, often large amounts of it, to control valuable land. Combine cheap debt with tax-deductible losses and rising property prices, and you create a powerful wealth-building machine. For those already inside the system, the superannuation advantage. But it doesn't stop there. Australia's retirement system, known as superannuation, adds another layer of advantage. Super accounts are tax-advantaged retirement vehicles. Contributions are taxed at a lower rate than regular income, and investment earnings inside super are also taxed favorably. And yes, you can hold property in them. If you own rental property through a super fund, rental income is often taxed at just 15%, significantly lower than many Australians' marginal income tax rates. When the asset is sold, capital gains taxes are also heavily discounted, sometimes even lower than 10% depending on the structure. Compare that to wage income, which can be taxed at much higher rates. The signal is clear. Earn income through work. Pay high taxes. Earn income through property. Pay less. Over time, investors followed the signal. The capital gains discount. In 1999, another major change occurred. The Australian government introduced a 50% capital gains tax discount for assets held longer than 1 year. That means if you buy a property and sell it at a profit, only half of that gain is subject to tax. For example, if you make a $200,000 gain, you're taxed as if you made $100,000. When combined with negative gearing, the strategy becomes obvious. Buy property using debt. Offset short-term losses against income. Wait for appreciation. Sell with discounted capital gains tax. This system doesn't just encourage ownership. It encourages speculation. And speculation drives prices upward. Who benefits? These policies overwhelmingly benefit. Higher income earners who gain more from tax deductions. Established homeowners. Older Australians with capital. Investors with access to leverage. Meanwhile, first-time buyers, especially young Australians, are competing against investors who receive government-backed tax advantages. It's not just a supply issue anymore. It's a structural imbalance. Data consistently shows that a large share of investment properties in Australia are negatively geared. That means many investors are intentionally holding properties that lose money in the short term, banking on long-term appreciation. And that dynamic shifts housing from being primarily about living to being about investing. The broader economic impact. Here's where things get even more concerning. When a country heavily incentivizes investment in housing, capital flows toward housing. Money that could fund startups, innovation, manufacturing, or technology instead pours into real estate. Why take the risk of building a new company when leveraged property offers tax advantages and decades of price growth? Over time, this affects national productivity. Australia's labor productivity growth between 2010 and 2020 averaged just over 1% per year, slower than previous decades. Research and development spending as a percentage of GDP also trails many comparable economies. While other nations double down on innovation, Australia has increasingly doubled down on property. This doesn't mean Australia lacks talent. It means the incentive structure directs capital elsewhere. And as one famous investor once said, Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. The outcome here? Rising household debt, sky-high land prices, slower productivity growth, and growing generational inequality. But this isn't about blaming one political party, because these policies were shaped and maintained by governments across decades. By now, the pattern is clear. Housing in Australia didn't become unaffordable overnight. It wasn't caused by a single prime minister. It wasn't triggered by one immigration spike. It wasn't the result of one bad policy. This crisis has been decades in the making, and it has survived multiple governments, from both sides of politics. A bipartisan boom. If you rewind to the early 1990s, Australian housing was relatively affordable compared to incomes. Under Prime Minister Paul Keating, Australia underwent major economic modernization. Financial markets were liberalized, productivity improved, and the country became more globally competitive. Housing prices rose modestly, but they were still tethered to incomes. Then came John Howard. During his tenure, housing prices surged dramatically. Low interest rates, the capital gains tax discount, and growing investor participation helped fuel one of the largest property booms in modern Australian history. Prices more than doubled. Then power shifted again. Under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, housing continued rising, briefly cooling during the global financial crisis but never truly correcting. After that came the coalition years. Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison. Housing still climbing. Then, under current leadership with Anthony Albanese, Australia closed out another decade with prices reaching new highs. If you bought a home in the early 1990s for $500,000, it could be worth well over $2 million today in major cities. If you were born after 1992, there's a good chance you don't own property at all. That's not a partisan outcome. That's structural. Why reform is so hard? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Roughly 2/3 of Australian households own their home. Many rely on rising property values as their primary source of wealth. Superannuation balances, retirement planning, family security, inheritance expectations, all tied to property. If prices fall sharply, millions of voters feel poorer overnight. That creates political paralysis. Any government proposing aggressive reforms risks backlash from homeowners, who are also the majority of voters. This creates what economists call a policy trap. Prices are too high for non-owners, but too important for owners. And when housing becomes the backbone of household wealth, even modest corrections feel dangerous. The productivity problem. Meanwhile, something else has been happening quietly in the background. Australia's economic growth per person has stagnated over the past decade. Real wages have struggled to keep pace with inflation. Productivity growth has slowed. Business investment outside mining and services has underperformed. At the same time, income taxes and corporate taxes remain relatively high compared to many OECD peers. So the incentive landscape looks like this. Work harder. Pay more tax. Build a company. Face regulatory and tax pressure. Buy property. Receive capital gains discounts and tax offsets. Over decades, capital flows where it is rewarded. And in Australia, property has been heavily rewarded. The long-term risk? An economy tilted toward asset appreciation rather than innovation. What would real solutions look like? Fixing this crisis isn't about a single silver bullet. It would likely require a combination of structural reforms, including gradually phasing out or reforming negative gearing, reducing capital gains tax discounts, streamlining zoning and development approvals, increasing medium-density housing, lowering tax burdens on productive business activity, encouraging investment in innovation and R&D. None of these changes are easy. All of them involve trade-offs. And any meaningful reform would need to be phased in carefully to avoid destabilizing the financial system. Because here's another reality. Australian households carry some of the highest mortgage debt levels in the world relative to income. A sudden crash would hurt the very people reform aims to help. A cultural shift. Beyond policy, there may need to be a cultural shift. For decades, property has been seen as the safest and smartest investment available. Dinner conversations revolve around house prices. Media headlines track auctions like sporting events. Housing became more than shelter. It became identity. Rebalancing that mindset takes time. It requires recognizing that a healthy housing market is one where people can afford to live, not just invest. The bigger question. So, where does this leave Australia? It remains one of the most beautiful, stable, and opportunity-rich countries in the world. But opportunity feels uneven. For homeowners, rising prices have built enormous wealth. For renters and young Australians, rising prices have built walls. The housing crisis is not just about economics. It's about fairness. It's about whether hard work still leads to stability. It's about whether the next generation will inherit opportunity or debt. The solution won't come from switching political teams every election cycle. It will come from informed citizens demanding smarter incentives. Because in the end, policy shapes markets. And markets shape lives. Australia built one of the most extraordinary property booms in modern history. The next chapter depends on whether it can build something even more important: balance.